Classical tragedy versus modern tragedy. What is classical tragedy? Classical tragedy is a famous form of drama that originates from Greek literary tradition. It defines the tragic plot as one with a noble or royal character losing, through his pride and prize. These brave, royal and noble heroes often face a reversal of their fortune. This reversal is typically due to the influence of divine power or the tragic flaw in the character. Fate also plays a main role in classical tragedies. Classical tragedy preserves the unities, one time span, one setting, one story as it was originated in the Greek theater. The timeline and place settings of classic tragedies are very large, and the basic concept is vengeance, i.e., Hamlet. The protagonist is from elite class or higher estate in classical tragedy. Tragic flaw, bloodshed, disaster, and death are the common elements in classical tragedy, and the incidents of a tragedy rotate with the protagonist. The classic tragedy is full of violence and on-stage death, for example, Macbeth. Some elements of the classical tragedy are, hamartia, a mistake made by a morally good person that is committed in ignorance, hubris, the false pride that leads to ruin, peripeteia, the reversal of fortune, and catharsis, emotional release at the end of the tragedy. Oedipus Rex. Romeo and Juliet. Hamlet, Medea. Antigone. Prometheus Bound. What is modern tragedy? Modern tragedy refers to the tragedies that were written and performed from the 20th century. This tragedy redefines the genre with ordinary protagonists, multiple plots, and realistic timelines and settings. The characters of modern tragedy are mainly from the middle class. Time is very limited, and place settings are quite smaller in modern tragedy. Modern tragedy is typically centered around common and ordinary people and their problem, making it more realistic. The conflict in modern tragedy is mainly caused by flaws in the characters, society or the law. Fate and divine power do not or rarely play a role in modern tragedy. The period is for several weeks, months or years. The differences in time in the modern tragedy is managed by elements such as pauses, flashbacks, flash forwards, and narrations. The protagonist of modern tragedy may have a white, black or gray character. The modern tragedy may have more than one or multiple plots, many characters and more than one unrealistic periods. The story of a modern tragedy is typically about ordinary people and their ambitions, problems, and aspirations. Modern tragedy rights also contain elements such as irony and sarcasm to highlight the flaws in characters. Death of a Salesman. A View from the Bridge. The Misfits. Glengarry Glen Ross. Difference between classical tragedy and modern tragedy. The classical tragedy has one unified plot with one time span, whereas the modern tragedy has more than one or multiple plots with many periods and flashbacks. In the classical tragedy, the protagonist is typically from a wealthy, noble or royal family. On the other hand, in the modern tragedy, the protagonist usually has a common, middle-class background. Classical tragedy mainly has one main or central character, conversely modern tragedy may have more than one central character. Classical tragedy typically contains elements such as hubris, hamartia, peripeteia, and catharsis, while modern tragedy uses elements like irony and sarcasm. The important elements of classical tragedy are fate and divine power. On the flip side, the basic elements of modern tragedy are realistic and common problems. Main difference. The main difference between classical tragedy and modern tragedy is that the classical tragedy has a unified plot with one noble or royal protagonist, and modern tragedy features ordinary people with real problems. Conclusion. Both classical and modern tragedies have a tragic end with several differences between them, but the importance of classical tragedy and modern tragedy remains at their place. Thanks for watching.